Sometimes, life gives you a chance to face emotions you never expected, at moments you didn't see coming. Some things, there's no preparation for, no matter your age, no matter how much life has already taught you. I never imagined something like this would happen to me, especially at this point in my life. But here we are. I'm 62, and while life has taught me many lessons, it has also taken just as much from me. James was the love of my life. He was vibrant, full of energy, always ready to soar through the skies. A pilot. He loved flying, and for me, that meant worrying. There's something about knowing someone's out there, high above the ground, that fills you with an endless sense of dread. And one day, that worry became my reality. I lost him in a plane crash 10 years ago. Since then, I've lived a life that feels quieter, less vibrant. The only part of James left in my life is our son, Ethan. He's 36 now, a successful engineer, and I couldn't be more proud of him. He's my pride and joy. But sometimes, in the silence of our home, I feel like a ghost. Ethan is so busy with his work and his life that it's like I'm barely there anymore. He's always been close to Lucas, his best friend, and sometimes it feels like Lucas is the one who knows me better than my own son. Lucas is 38, and just like James, he's a pilot. Maybe that's why Ethan and Lucas were always so close. Lucas was more than just a friend to Ethan, he was a part of him. There were times I couldn't help but feel that Lucas was the embodiment of James in some ways. He was always around, cheerful, kind, and ever helpful. I'd gotten used to him being a constant presence at our house, even when Ethan wasn't around. His visits became a regular part of my life, and I welcomed them. But when Ethan told me he was going to be out of town for a week last month, I didn't know that it would be the start of something that would change everything. It was late afternoon when I returned from the grocery store, bags in hand, ready to unload them. But as I stood by the door, I realized something terrible. I couldn't find my keys. I checked my purse, my pockets, nothing. The keys had disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. I stood there, helpless, feeling a wave of frustration. That's when Lucas drove by, his car slowing as he spotted me. "Maggie, everything okay?" he asked, leaning out the window with that warm, familiar smile of his. "I think I've lost my keys," I said, feeling a little embarrassed. "And there's no spare inside. I don't know what to do." Without hesitation, Lucas jumped out of the car. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice confident and reassuring. He quickly called a locksmith, and within minutes, someone was on their way to open the door. As we waited, I couldn't help myself. I had to tell him. "You remind me of James," I said softly. "He used to handle everything so quickly, just like you." Lucas looked a little surprised, but then a small smile touched his lips. There was a glint of pride in his eyes. "I guess I learned from the best," he said, his voice warm, before we fell into a comfortable silence as the locksmith arrived. Once the door was open, I felt the need to thank him, truly thank him for his help. "How about a coffee?" I asked. "I owe you for running around like this." We went inside, and as I prepared the coffee, Lucas casually settled into a chair at the kitchen table. It was strange, really, being alone with him like this. He'd been around our house so many times over the years, but it had always been with Ethan. Now it was just the two of us. As I set the coffee cups on the table, we started talking, and I was surprised at how easily our conversation flowed. Lucas had always fascinated me, mainly because of his connection to James. Both of them had that same passion for flying, and although it terrified me, I couldn't deny the allure of it. But as we sat there, the conversation shifted. Lucas opened up about his past, something I hadn't known before. "I was married once," he said, taking a sip of his coffee, "but it didn't work out. We loved each other, but our lives were just too different. We couldn't make it work." He kept his voice steady, but there was a sadness in it that he couldn't completely hide. After a moment, he added, "It's been 4 years since we got divorced, but I'm doing better now. I've thrown myself into my work, and things are in balance for me now." I could see the honesty in his eyes, and for some reason, that made me respect him even more. There was something so rare about someone who could be both strong and vulnerable at the same time. After losing James, my perspective on men had changed. It was hard to find that balance, but Lucas seemed to possess it. I smiled softly. "Ethan never really thought about getting married," I said. "He's always been so focused on his career, I think." Lucas grinned. "I believe he'll meet someone special one day. It's just a matter of time." Our conversation deepened. We talked about James, of course, and Ethan, and Lucas even shared a bit about his own childhood. There was something comforting about this openness, this vulnerability we were sharing. It was a connection I hadn't expected, but one that felt strangely right. At one point, I shared the story of how I first met James, the whirlwind of emotions I'd felt. I told Lucas how we'd fallen in love so quickly, how everything had just fallen into place. He listened intently, his eyes softening as I spoke. "You're lucky," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I can't even imagine the pain you went through when you lost James." The warmth of his words settled over me like a blanket. For so long, I'd avoided talking about James. Every time his name came up, I'd quickly change the subject, but with Lucas, it was different. His empathy felt so real, so raw, and it brought a warmth from deep inside me that I hadn't expected. We talked for hours. The time passed unnoticed, the conversation flowing naturally, and in the end, I found myself not wanting it to stop. But as the evening wore on, I knew it was time for him to leave. Lucas stood up and made his way to the door, turning around just before leaving. "Thank you, Maggie," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Really?" He opened his arms, and instinctively, I stepped forward and embraced him. The hug wasn't just a huge, it was something more. The moment our bodies connected, I felt a shift. Time seemed to stand still. There was an electric pull between us, something undeniable and deep. It was strange, yet comforting. It was like I had been searching for this connection for years, and now it was finally here. Lucas must have felt it too, because as we held each other, he pulled me closer. The hug deepened, and with it, the weight of the moment grew. Our hearts were beating faster, and our breaths grew short. We pulled apart slowly, but when we looked into each other's eyes, there was something we both knew, but neither of us could say. "Good night, Maggie," Lucas said, his voice still carrying that tremor of emotion. I just nodded, my heart racing as I watched him leave. As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange emptiness inside me. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite grasp. The moment had changed something in me. It was as if everything had shifted just slightly and the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The days following Lucas's visit felt different. I couldn't stop thinking about that hug, about the connection that had sparked between us. It was a fleeting moment, yes, but something in the way Lucas had held me, the warmth in his embrace, lingered with me long after he left. It wasn't just the hug, though. It was everything that had led up to it, the conversation, the ease with which we shared our thoughts, the way we made each other laugh, how we could talk about James without it being painful. For a long time, I hadn't allowed myself to talk about him, and now I felt like I could. And that felt healing in ways I hadn't expected. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't fully accept the shift that had occurred. What had happened between us felt like something more than just a friendly moment. It was like we had crossed a line, and it was impossible to uncross it. I spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, trying to figure out how to reconcile what I was feeling. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just some brief spark of connection. It was real. I spent most of my days lost in thought, going through the motions of my routine checking on Ethan, doing housework, preparing meals. But even in those mundane moments, my mind would drift back to Lucas. It was a week before I saw him again. Ethan was still out of town, and I was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner when I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and yet I knew instantly who it was. I opened the door, and there stood Lucas, with that familiar smile, his dark eyes gleaming as if he'd been thinking about the same things I had. "Maggie," he said, his voice warm, "I brought you something." He held up a small bouquet of flowers. Nothing extravagant, just a few sunflowers, simple and bright. "I thought these might brighten your day," he added. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the flowers. "Thank you, Lucas. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted gently, stepping inside as I stepped back to let him in. We were standing in the kitchen again, and as Lucas set the flowers on the counter, there was a silence that hung between us. It wasn't awkward, just full of possibility. And as I looked at him, really looked at him, I realized that whatever had happened between us that night wasn't going away. It wasn't something I could just forget. "I've been thinking," Lucas began, and I could hear a hesitation in his voice. He didn't seem quite sure of what to say next, and that only made me more curious. "About what happened that evening?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. My heart was beating faster, and I felt like the air between us had become thicker, charged with something unspoken. "I didn't want you to think I was just being overly friendly," Lucas continued, his words slow and measured. "I want you to know that I care about you, Maggie. I care about you more than I thought I would." His confession hit me like a wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I hadn't expected it. Of course, I had wondered if Lucas felt the same way, but hearing it out loud, hearing him say it, made it all real. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice soft, barely audible. I care about you too, but I don't know what this is or what it means. We've both been through so much." Lucas stepped closer, his hand resting gently on my arm. "I know, Maggie. I'm not asking for anything right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel." I swallowed hard, my emotions swirling inside me. I had never thought this would happen, never thought that I would be in this situation. It wasn't just about Ethan's best friend anymore. It was about Lucas himself, about the undeniable pull that had drawn me to him. "I don't know what to do with this," I said, the words feeling like they were coming from someone else. "You don't have to do anything," Lucas replied quietly. "I just wanted you to know. I want to be here, however you need me to be." For a long while, we just stood there, the silence between us now filled with something profound and unspoken. Finally, I looked up at him, my gaze steady and unwavering. "I don't want to rush anything," I said softly, my voice more confident now. But I want to see where this goes. We can take it slow." Lucas's face softened, and he nodded, his eyes shining with something that made my heart flutter. "I'm okay with that, Maggie. I'll be here for you no matter what." And with that, everything shifted again. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it felt monumental all the same. The distance between us, the hesitations, the uncertainties, they melted away in that simple exchange. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet moments, together long walks, cups of coffee shared at the kitchen table, and endless conversations that went deep into the night. We both had our baggage, of course Lucas with his past marriage, and me with the grief of losing James, but somehow it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something we could build on together, something stronger than either of us had anticipated. And yet, despite all the moments we shared, there was still a part of me that was afraid of what it meant to open up again, to trust in someone after all these years. Afraid that maybe I wasn't ready for this kind of connection, even though I knew deep down that I wanted it. But Lucas was patient. He never pushed me. He never made me feel like I had to rush into anything, and that was what made all the difference. A month later, as Ethan returned from his trip, everything felt different. Ethan had no idea what had been happening between me and Lucas, but he could tell that something had shifted. He'd noticed how Lucas had been coming over more frequently, how the air in the house felt lighter. "Mum," Ethan said one evening after dinner as we sat together at the table, "you seem different, happier." I smiled at him, my heart full. "Maybe I am," I replied softly. "Maybe I am." But even as I said the words, I couldn't help but wonder, what did the future hold? What did all of this mean for me, for Ethan, for Lucas? And how could I navigate the feelings that had started to bloom in my heart? I didn't have the answers, not yet. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. And sometimes that's all you need, a little bit of hope.